Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. Today we're going to talk about something that's very near and dear to me called don't mix your extension and your flexion. So how do we keep extension out of spinal flexion? Now hang in there for a second, you'll understand what I'm talking about. When we kind of organize our thinking in the TRS world, we are very spine-centric. And ultimately we're central nervous system centric, right? Because we see that this brain container, right, central nervous system container, potentially has the greatest loss of potential when you challenge it, when you put kinks in the system, when it's tired, when it's fatigued, you don't stabilize. Let's appreciate that the brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. Let that hang there for a second. And by extension, your entire nervous system is part of that brain system. So it's attached to this incredible body, which anti-robust, badass spine that is quite complex in its ability to problem solve, move, rotate, right? Just the number of curves in the spine alone that allow us to handle huge axial loads. One of our friends just deadlifted 501. I mean, come on, let's talk about how rad the spine is. But one of the mistakes we see is a lot of times when we're trying to add flexion into our programming, or we see athletes flexing their spines, they're not good at it. So one of the models proposed around the spine by Philip Beach is called, thinking about the spine as a radial contractile field. And basically, the musculature, one of the roles of the musculature around the spine is to maintain the integrity of the tube. Very simple. So that everything contracts towards the center to stiffen appropriately, to manage, to compress the fluids that are the trunk. And a lot of, in result, we have is a very stable system, and we have a spine that can withstand a whole lot of silliness and craziness and still be awesome. So it's this radial contractile field. Now, one of the things that we've talked about before in the past here is that when we see deflection, so when the musculature should be stiffening or shrinking towards the middle, and we see part of that bulge out, the technical term for that is a herniation. Now, I don't mean spinal herniation, a herniation of your disc. I mean, it's actually like when you bake a hot dog and you get a blister on that hot dog and kind of hot dog goes, that's a herniation, right? And the idea here is that if I'm flexing over and touching my toes, I should be compressing to the spine. And one of the good models around this is, or a simple idea is, if you had a string around your waist, as I move over and start to add flexion loads, my trunk theoretically is squeezing towards the center, right? The yogis have been saying belly button to spine for, I don't know, 2,000 years. And the idea is I'm not sucking, I'm not hollowing, I'm not drawing, I'm just stiffening. But the stiffening, contracting means that the volume of the belly remains constant. So if I maintain this mid-range position, here's my two-hand rule, squat down or hinge, this volume is the same. Now, as I push really hard and I have huge weights, I might see some deflection in that thing, right? Because the whole compression of that trunk, everything's getting pushed out, diaphragm is pushing down. But that's still not a herniation. That's not one aspect of the thing going wild, which is usually belly coming out. So as I flex over and go to touch my toes, for example, what you should see is that that belly button should be drawing towards the spine to compress the spine, stabilize the spine, maintain the length of the spinal column, the length of the container. When you bend over and flex and touch your toes, right, and you're all the way here, your spine can become upwards of 10 centimeters longer. I'm not talking about your actual CNS, I'm talking about the container of the CNS, which means your nervous tissue has to run and slide and glide and self-equalize and be able to manage that change in volume, container volume, and it has to be able to move and manage that. Sometimes everyone thinks, for example, that the disc is pushing on the nerve, but sometimes the nerve gets bowstrung onto the disc. So one of the ways that we can improve the function of the whole system is to make sure that we're not mixing flexion and extension. So here's an example. Imagine that I'm trying to put a big, nice flexion load into this pipe, right? And so all the systems are working, and I still got to move my legs and do whatever I got to do. But all of a sudden, in the middle of this big flexion load, part of my system starts to extend. So now I've got forces pulling into extension while the spine is trying to flex. This is chiefly why people oftentimes have back pain in biking. Basically, they're missing, the bike doesn't put us in a great position sometimes, mechanically. Missing hip flexion pushes the spine to flexion, and then I've got to be able to stabilize this pelvis in flexion so that I can drive that leg around. What ends up happening is I get this tug of war between psoas and iliacus and the rest of the system, and there are a lot of competing what end up being shear forces on the spine. So in short, what I'm talking about is that if I go to flex my back or be in a hollowed position or round or curve or recover on the rowing machine, and all of a sudden you see the belly push out, that is a cue about loss of stability around the spine, loss of potential intra-abdominal pressure, because I have a bigger container that I have to contend with. But secondarily, it's often a sign that as I round over, and you'll see that the head comes back, and as I'm trying to create flexion in the system, now I've introduced a bunch of extension loads, and the spine can't continue to flex. So when we see people bend over to touch their toes, and part of that system defaults into a little bit of lordosis, right? I've added this extension load right in the middle of my flexion. I have competing forces on my spine, which results in a net loss of ability to handle load, ability to handle flexion load. If I repeatedly do that, I'll have some segments that are always doing all the motion and some segments that aren't. I put a lot of competing shear forces, and this should never be about, am I likely to get injured? It's about, am I likely to get beat? Is this a good position where I can breathe? Can I activate or recruit my pelvic floor? What the heck is going on with the compensations in the rest of the system? So in short, when you're trying to flex, an easy way to pick that up is, especially as you're bending over and touching your toes here, is that belly button is not bulging, because even in this position I'm in flexion, but with my belly bulging out, I've just added a huge weird extension load. And this is one of the mechanisms for why people actually have back pain or sensitivity or load intolerance or force intolerance in the spine when they hinge. So they don't hinge, they start to introduce these, instead of being stable, they start to introduce these positions, and now I've got some segments that are flexing, some segments that are dragging to extension, and there's just a poorly intolerant system. So the idea here is, one of the reasons we teach flexion is to make sure that people can identify ways to compress and identify when they've lost that position or they're being inefficient by judging their belly volume. And as you're trying to help people sort some of these issues out, when you start to see multiple segments of the spine competing for different things without also solving a complex motor problem in the process, what we're thinking is, hey, that's not very reproducible, and it sure as heck isn't very elegant. See you tomorrow.